So this is an extract from one of Pat Buchanan's article in the Washington Times in 1990. He says, "There's nothing wrong with Americans dreaming of a republic which, by the year 2000, encompasses the maritime and western provinces of Canada, the Yukon and Northwest Territories all the way to the pole, and contains the world's largest island, Greenland, purchased from Denmark, giving the United States a landmass rivaling that of the USSR under a constitution permitting all of our people freedom to realize all their dreams. The 21st century, then, could not but be the second American century." So this is now throughout the 1990s, several times he reiterated this continental vision in much more threatening terms. In an interview for American Enterprise, and this is 1998, he says, "Canada is going to be absorbed in the United States. It's already economically. If I were a Canadian, I'd be nervous as I could be." Right. Now, remember as well that, this is so 1998, 1999, 2000. Him and Trump were both vying for influence within the Reform Party. Right? They were competing for the presidential candidature for the Reform Party. Now, Trump abandoned the project by the late 1990s because he thought the Reform Party was a real mess, and in the end, Buchanan got the presidency, got the candidature, and ran for president for the Reform Party. But Trump was, 100% aware of the America First, narrative and program that the Paleos had developed for him, throughout the 1990s, because he was constantly sort of, in constant debate with Buchanan to get that candidacy. He talked, he accused Buchanan to be a racist and homophobe and a crank.
Trump's the more liberal.
He always was.
Yeah.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Welcome. This is BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history, and my name is Alex Hochuli. I'm in São Paulo, Brazil. I'm with Lee Jones, contributing editor, who's in London. Hello, Lee.
Hi, Alex.
And we have joining us today Jean-François Drolet, henceforth JF, who's a professor in politics and international relations at Queen Mary in London, which makes him a colleague of Lee's. Sharp listeners will have picked out already. His most recent book is called The World of the Right, Radical Conservatism and Global Order, which is co-authored with Michael Williams, who you'll have heard on the podcast at the start of 2025, I believe. It was actually a very popular episode then, and we promised, as we, I think, concluded that episode, that we'd be doing a lot more on this and that we'd have some of the co-authors on. So I'm very happy to welcome JF on today to do just that.
Thank you, Alex. Very delighted to be here.
Yeah, I'm very eager to begin this conversation. So I'm going to try to rush over what I've got to say as means of introduction, because, at the end of history, politics is back. At least that's what we have been saying for a long time. Sort of. I think the delivery bot got the order slightly wrong and brought us lots of boxes of geopolitics. Politics proper, I'm not so sure. Can offer you culture wars in return, but I'm not entirely certain about politics. We can maybe inquire into that later on in the episode. But facetiousness aside, I think we're faced with a confusing thing. Donald Trump combines a declaredly America First politics, but one which is seemingly contradicted by an imperialist coveting of Greenland, the kidnapping of Maduro, the attempt to meddle in internal Brazilian affairs, dropping bombs in Nigeria, and so on. So I think a lot of people are asking whether this is continuity with American neoconservatism or a radical break or something else entirely. In Europe, the radical right also exemplifies what I think are contradictory attitudes. So in one moment, it might be sovereigntist, defensive, and cynical in the sense of not really buying the big ideals of liberal internationalists, and especially those advanced by the EU. But in another moment, it's an expounder of big ideas about civilization and civilizational conflict. Some are Atlanticist, while others are more wary of U.S. preponderance, whatever affinity they may have with Trump personally or politically or otherwise. So I think it's quite a confusing picture, and one which we've been striving to unpick over the past year, and we're going to focus down on doing that this year even more so. This episode is, I in a way, the first of a two-parter on U.S. foreign policy under Trump. A lot's happened in January 2026, you may have noticed. So this is a way of broaching this, firstly, with a wider lens and then a slightly narrower one. So in this episode today, we're going to look at the ideological roots of Trump's foreign policy in paleoconservatism, discuss its relationship to neoconservatism. We'll also look at the radical right in Europe, asking related questions. And for the record, we're recording this on Friday, the 30th of January, just in case something incredible happens in the next 5 days until this episode comes out. So just to bear that in mind, in case people are listening to this and going, I can't believe you didn't talk about Trump invading Micronesia. I think actually the US probably has, Lee will know better. Probably the US already controls that. There's no need to invade Micronesia, but whatever. Next week, or the episode that you'll hear the following week that comes out after this, we're going to inquire into Trump's ostensible hemispheric foreign policy, his defense of the Monroe Doctrine, which people are now calling the Dunroe Doctrine, which I don't love, but whatever, and his assertion of US supremacy over Latin America. What's behind his attack on Venezuela? What's the administration's attitude to Cuba? And is this all continuity neoconservatism in the kind of Marco Rubio guise, or is it something new? And I guess something which might underlay this, we might not be able to ask this question directly, but it's our concern going forward, and I think that should be obvious to long-time listeners of the podcast, is whether this new era offers any opportunities for independent sovereign politics, because the risks and dangers of the moment are rather obvious, I think, to anyone involved. Right. I'm going to pass on to Lee, who's going to start off the interview / conversation with JF. So take it away.
Thanks, Alex. So, JF, Alex mentioned we had your co-author and long-time collaborator, Mike Williams, on episode 461 to discuss your co-author book on the world of the right. But just to refresh listeners' memories, can you explain the paleoconservative worldview? How do they understand the contemporary problems that we find ourselves in? What do they seek to do about it? Because I think when we do that, that unlocks a lot of our understanding about what the Trumpists are up to.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. Yeah, I mean, paleoconservatism, like many movements in American right, is a rather diverse movement, but there's a number of line of analyses and critique that you see running across from the early 1980s all the way to the present there that kind of joins all these different sort of sub-factions within the movement. And one of the key arguments here that has been central to their work, and you see that in Chronicles magazine, which is one of the main publications that have been running since the 1980s, but that had probably peaked in the early to mid 1990s, is that a great deal of what is wrong in contemporary politics and international relations is caused by the ascendancy of liberal managerialism and the rule of the so-called new class. So let me explain a little bit what that is. I'm sure Michael's talked about it a little bit, but like you say, we'll just refresh audience memory a little bit. This analysis in great part is inspired by the work of the American conservative political theorist James Burnham, who was a former Trotskyist who moved to join the American right and became a leading public intellectuals in the post-war era for the American right. So especially here his book, The Managerial Revolution, which was published in 1941. Now, paleoconservatives, especially people like Sam Francis and Paul Gottfried, drew on it to develop a political sociology of liberal modernity that could explain the changing character of American conservatism, of American democracy and world politics, and that could also mobilize support for their nationalist vision against the globalizing designs of the establishment, right? So this was both a reading of the contemporary world order at the same time as a part of a strategy of mobilization. The narrative itself of narrating how international politics works became part of constructing a populist nationalism. Okay. Now, in essence, the paleoconservative theory of managerialism contends that contemporary America is ruled by an intersecting technocracy or intersecting group of technocratic elites that have achieved hegemonic status during the 20th century by displacing the old industrial commercial bourgeoisie that had governed the United States from the 1860s onwards, right? Now, this managerial elite, the so-called new class, is defined by its mastery of the technical skills that enable late modern societies to function. Right? Now, these skills include not only science and engineering, but also law, administration, social psychology, and a whole range of other techniques that have become central to the management of complex, large mass societies. Okay, so we're talking here about state agencies, about economic corporations, the media, educational institutions, foundations, and other such institutions of mass culture. Right. So basically, the skills that you need to make a mass society run. Right. And so here, whereas the old bourgeois elite regarded governmental power as a potential threat to its interest and sought to conserve the status quo, the new class is intrinsically accelerationist, right? It perceives its interest in the expansion of government structures and the constant change in the construction of society, right? Now, this is because to maintain and expand the rewards and of its technical skills, it must constantly generate a need for its own skills, right? And so the new class, that elite, is in itself intrinsically progressive. It is intrinsically pushing for the reorganization and restructuring of society, the transformation of society all the time. It is liberal in the sense that it professes commitment to the well-being of others, okay, and is concerned with largely policing prejudice, dealing with things like migration, dealings with civil conflict, and basically managing society. So there's an intrinsically sort of meliorist dimension to all this. Now, so what paleoconservative argue is that ultimately the emergence of the welfare state, the New Deal, global liberal governance, all those massive structures of governance are ultimately driven by this structure of interest here of that technocratic elite. And so a lot of what they want to do is to mobilize support against that conglomerate of interest, if you like, by mobilizing a form of nationalism that is radically different from what America has had in the past, right? So this is not the creedal liberalism or the civic nationalist tradition that Huntington and Seymour Martin Lipset and all these guys were celebrating. What they want is a kind of nationalism of the sort that radical right movement in Europe have produced in the past and that America never really had, right? Something like resembling some kind of blood and soil nationalism that is ethnic based and that is a defense of the white Anglo-Saxon majority culture.
So tell us a bit about how that translates into their attitude to foreign policy. Maybe just tell us how paleoconservatives differ in their outlook from neoconservatives that people will be a lot more familiar with over the last 20 years.
Yes, absolutely. So essentially, paleoconservatism articulated itself against neoconservatism. Right? It's important to understand that the paleoconservatives emerged and became an ideology of its own in the mid 1980s and kind of coalesced a lot more in the early 1990s as a reaction to the perceived dominance of the neoconservatives within the conservative establishment. So increasingly, the paleos found themselves pushed out of the movement they had helped to create in the 1970s and 1960s, and increasingly were becoming marginal into a neoconservative, into a conservative movement that, in their eyes, had become liberal. Right? This was the difference was here that the neocons were, at least in the eyes of the paleos, they were fake conservatives. They were basically liberals, former Trotskyists, right, who had taken over the Republican Party and had taken over the conservative movement, and had done so by promoting a fusion between neoliberalism, neoconservatism, and then traditional conservatives in the context of anti-communism. But of course, they had done so in ways that, on the one hand, so the neocons were claiming to defend historic communities and family values and traditions, at the same time as they were aggressively promoting neoliberal globalization and free market ideologies that were in fact undermining that kind of traditional values. Right? So this was a lost project. So for right from the early 1990s, the paleos saw, and you could see this, of course, in terms of international politics, right? What had started, so the Cold War had started, and the conservative had entered the Cold War in the mid 20th century as a struggle to defend Christianity and historic communities against a godless communist, enemy of totalitarian enemy, and it ended up in the end by waging crusades to promote democracy and turn the whole world into America's image. And so in terms of foreign policy, the paleos, this is when they first articulated their America First foreign policy agenda as a critique of the neoconservative vision of the post-Cold War order. Now, as we know, of course, the neocons, the plan at the time, their argument at the time was that the best way to maintain international order was to extend American hegemony to the entire surface of the earth and as far in the future as possible, right? And this was done by a critique of realism, arguing that in the current condition, realism was no longer viable, that it was a cynical form of foreign policy that could not mobilize support for its own foreign policy prescription because it was too cynical and under conditions of globalization and after the end of history and all these things, that kind of cynical foreign policy would not work. This was supported by an exceptionalist set of argument that America was, of course, exceptional, that it was, shouldering the burden of history and projecting history forward, and it was its role to provide the public good and so on. The paleos were radically objected to all of these things, right? They also wanted a second American century, right? Pat Buchanan in 1989, 1990 comes out and makes this argument for the second American century. But this was only going to happen by disengaging America from the Cold War structure that had been built since 1945. Now, these guys, what they were arguing was for a kind of populist realism in that context, right? So populist realism that was unlike, what some of us know in international relations, was not a realism based on assumptions about human nature, like you would find in the works of Hans Morgenthau and other classical realists, or assumptions about the rational choice theory or the structure of international system, like you find in the work of systemic realists like Kenneth Waltz or John Mearsheimer. But a realism that was grounded in the argument that this was just a common view of the average American, realism aligned with the opinion of the American people, and this is what should be guiding our foreign policy. And so they argued for disengagement. They argued for putting an end to all forms of engagement into structures of global governance, military humanitarianism, democracy promotion, none of that regime change policy stuff, and that ultimately the ways in which American supremacy would be maintained would be by using all these guts and reinvest them in advanced defense systems, so missile systems, and investing in the Navy and the Air Force to guarantee the freedom, to guarantee that US has control over the seas, right? But no, so withdrawing from Europe, withdrawing from mainland Asia. And so that was the plan at the time. So that was fundamentally different from what the neocons were arguing at the time.
I mean, I remember it was probably the run up to the Iraq War where I first learned of the term paleoconservative. And I thought, well, okay, but, in opposing the Iraq War and indeed the kind of forever wars that followed over the course of the following decade, you're thinking, well, the paleocons, of course, I disagree with them on lots of things, but actually these seem at least honest conservatives, people who are principled and consistent and who don't generate the problems that they then seek to solve with their politics. Instead, they're kind of isolationists and so on. So I have problems with certain aspects, but we can deal with these people, and maybe this is interesting at least to read their critiques of neoconservatism. Now, Lee, you have a piece which is coming out, I believe it's not out yet, in American Affairs. It's on Trump's new national security strategy. And I think for listeners, when it does come out, you really should go and check it out. It's, I think, essential reading. And in terms of understanding Trump, it forms a really essential pair with an essay that Lee wrote for American Affairs for the same journal last year on Trump's tariffs. So I do urge people to check that out. In that, you make reference to the paleoconservatives and the way that they've influenced Trump's foreign policy and his stated strategy in the national security strategy document. But you also mentioned, I think, make reference to Pat Buchanan, who, back in the 90s also made comments to the effect of, being admiring of a certain essential Americanness, which is in itself expansionist, violent, aggressive, and so on. And I don't think we should reduce, international politics purely to isolationist versus expansionist. Although that's, it's an important bit, and especially if you're looking at the US empire, what's it doing, And so which way do the paleoconservatives point? for you, Lee, and particularly in your understanding as that plays through and plays into Trump's strategy, where does the paleoconservative element point to?
Yeah, I think the article should be out, in fact, by the time this episode goes to air, because it should be coming out on the 1st of February.
Right.
So the piece is trying to essentially use JF and Mike's work to interpret the national security strategy and understand it as fundamentally a paleoconservative document, although there are other factions shaping foreign policy and at the level of doctrine and practice. But I think if you don't foreground paleoconservative thought, you can't really understand what the Trumpists are actually doing and what they're saying they're doing and why they're doing it. So all this talk in the media about Trump's a realist, he's retreating from liberalism to realism, and now he's operating a hemispheric foreign policy and retreating to great power spheres of influence. I just think that cannot explain a lot of what the Americans are doing. They're attacking European leaders as being a greater threat to European security than Russia. Attacking your allies and coddling your adversaries is not a realist notion. The NSS explicitly denies spheres of influence to other major powers, particularly China, it is implied. And Russia's not to be allowed to dominate Europe either. And American interventions are obviously not limited to its near abroad. So yes, there's the stuff in Venezuela and Panama and Greenland and so on, but there's also attacks on Iran, bombing of Nigeria, and the NSS commits the United States to activity in Asia, Europe, Middle East, Africa. So I think really we have to understand that there is a paleoconservative movement and it's now in government. And so it is influencing both the doctrine and the practice of American foreign policy. And I would say there's probably about 5 different aspects of this policy. The first few reflect really strong paleo agenda. And then there's others that overlap with the paleo agenda, but I think are more influenced by more traditional factions. So the top line is very paleo. It's all about rolling back globalism, this new class globalism at home and its extensions abroad, and then revitalizing what they see as traditional Western civilization, both domestically and internationally. So the national security strategy typically is focused on external threats, but there's loads of stuff in there about essentially internal threats to American security, which are conceived of as being like woke DEI policies. There's a commitment to like reviving traditional families, all that kind of stuff. And then in the European side, the way that it frames the strategic situation in Europe is not, oh, well, Russia invaded Ukraine and what are we going to do about that? It's that in hard power terms, Europe could obviously contain Russia by itself. But the problem is Europe is run by all these globalist elites who are deluded and want to drag America into perpetuating the Ukraine war. And they're doing this against the wishes of their own populations. And so the strategy there is to help bring to power other radical right movements who will behave more sensibly and allow America to withdraw and restore strategic stability with Russia. So that's the first sort of bucket of policies, if you like, is rolling back globalism at home and abroad. The second is multipolarity. And again, this is a big difference from realism. Realism by multipolarity means dispersion of power among several great powers. What multipolarity means in the paleo tradition is a live and let live approach to other civilizations. So we're going to defend Western civilization in the West, in Europe and the United States, but we're not going to try and spread that culture, that system, to others. That they've got their civilization, we've got ours. We have a live and let live approach. So we're not going to be promoting democracy and human rights anymore. The third strand is a robust defense of the homeland, capitalized in the national defense strategy, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. Now, that is partly about tackling threats that paleoconservatives have been going on about for a long time, migration, drugs, and so on. But underlying all of that in the Western Hemisphere is a desire to squeeze out what is coded as non-hemispheric competitors, which really means China. So that fear of China really, I think, pervades a lot of the stuff in the Western Hemisphere, which we might talk about more in the upcoming episode. And there we're starting to shade into parts where I think other factions within the Trump regime are inserting their priorities. So I think there are neocons in the regime, but then I don't think that they're all powerful by any means. And of course, the Pentagon is still a very powerful establishment. And I think still there's there's a shared commitment here to primacy against all other challengers, especially China, which is given, deterring China is given equal priority in the national defense strategy to defense of the homeland. So on the one hand, the paleos want to accommodate China and say, we're not going to try and change your regime anymore, right? And we don't want to humiliate you and so on. But strategically, the commitment is still to containing China geopolitically, so deterring it over Taiwan and keeping the South China Sea open. These are very traditional geostrategic goals, that China's going to be bottled up. It's not going to have its sphere of influence, right up to China's borders or inside Chinese territory from the perspective of the regime in Beijing. The Americans are going to intervene there. And then the demands for economic change in China amount to a demand that China dismantles its growth model, which is essentially what Trump and the US Treasury clique are pursuing through negotiations at the moment. So although there's this peeling back from confrontation with China on one level, the objectives being sought amount to a demand for capitulation on China's red lines, which isn't going to happen. So essentially, I think their sort of more traditional hawkish elements are creating a fallback position for confrontation with China when the talks fail. And then the fifth strand is the desire to shunt the costs of American primacy onto others. And I talked about that a lot in the piece on tariffs that you mentioned. That, I think, reflects this view of what I call the US Treasury clique, that American hegemony is unaffordable in its current model. Not necessarily undesirable, but certainly unaffordable. So allies and partners are going to have to cough up a lot more and step up to maintain the order that the United States wants in other areas, while the US will also use aggressive trade and industrial policy to reassert its domination. Now, that's clearly, full of contradictions in practice, but it's papered over by this commitment to America being number one, America first, which doesn't just mean prioritizing American national interests. It means maintaining America's position in the global pecking order. And then what I also try to do in the article, like I did with the tariffs one, was to mediate between two positions that I don't think are particularly helpful. One is that there's some careful grand strategy at work, and once we get that, we'll understand everything that Trump is doing, which I think is clearly not quite right. And then the other is, well, Trump's just demented, so he just makes it up on as he goes along, which I don't think is right either. So we have to sort of mediate between the fact that there is this movement, there is this coterie of officials around him, but yet at the same time, this is a populist and highly personalist regime. So the reality is that when it comes to determining what the interests are, what is the national interest that should animate America first, it is left heavily to Trump. Yes, there are these vying factions that I've laid out, but there's also him as this very arbitrary and idiosyncratic person. And the result, therefore, is in practice quite erratic policies that do reflect, to a large extent, this kind of tonal background of paleoconservative thought. But sometimes will just reflect his own idiosyncrasies. And the documents have explicit carve-outs for him to be able to do whatever he likes, wherever he likes, despite the insistence on a narrow preservation of self-interest. So I think what you can see is, in practice, because populism is the decay of democratic representation, is you will sometimes get policies that seem to reflect the interests of the American people, or at least the people that elected Trump. And then sometimes you'll get policies that really don't do those things and are actually divisive even in the MAGA base, or like in the case of Venezuela, which appear to be about serving the interests of American big business, but big business doesn't actually want to go along with the adventure.
And more on that in the following episode, the one that comes out after this. I mean, Lee, you conclude your piece by pointing out that it's basically American protectionism at home and American primacy abroad, which sounds a lot like having your cake and eating it. And obviously that has the capacity to alienate a lot of people, whether in the short term or in the long term, as a result that America is not an ally anymore. JF, I wonder how, in your reading of the ideological bases of the new right, especially as it plays out in international relations and foreign policy, if you see the bases there for critiquing that sort of policy and that sort of strategy as spelled out in that document from the part of the new right, particularly kind of from the US? And do you think they will challenge Trump on that, or is the allegiance and the fealty to some vague, fuzzy notion of America first enough to bind it all together?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I mean, I think the answer is a bit of both, right? And I think that, as Lee pointed out, the backdrop of all this is, the cultural war against globalism and, the liberal managerial elite, the new class, or whatever you want to call them, or sometimes they use the different names for it. But for a very long time, what conjoined that new right, what made it global, if you like, is that they all basically understood that in order to pursue their agenda in national context, they had to undermine international liberal order, right? They couldn't actually do what they do, whatever they needed to do at home, they had to do it abroad first, right? It had to be done in a global way, in the same way that Trump is attacking leaders in Europe and so on, because they understand very, 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 very clearly that woke ideologies and managerial ideologies they're global and they must be attacked everywhere. And so there is, I think, across, the new right, or the global right, if you like, a shared sort of, there is some support for Trump, from what Trump is doing, in some way that there is some support for what Putin is doing, in the sense that, it's attacking liberal regimes of governance and that kind of things, and liberal mentalities and so on. And so there is support there. But there are lots of, people who will speak out against it in different contexts, right? Depending on, the issue that is being discussed and so on. So it's difficult to sort of extrapolate a general position here and say, well, so yes, I have read some, lots of voice in the US who support Trump, but they think that what he's done in Venezuela is just stupid. Right? It's just not the way of doing this. So in the same way that, back in 2003, people shared the same ideology, but applied it to Iraq in different ways, right? Some thought that Iraq was a mistake, and then some thought that Iraq was. And so how they apply it to the empirics will differ, and a lot of it will depend on the more local, regional, or national context in which they are. So there is some critique, definitely, from the right in that regard, for the, both in Europe, in North America, and I'm pretty sure elsewhere also. So that's not. But at the same time, I mean, it's a lot of. There's so much happening. There is so much happening from all sides. It's difficult to keep up, right? It's difficult to understand what, really, what strategy is. I mean, so Lee's paper is absolutely brilliant. I had the pleasure of reading it last night, and I thought, yeah, that's it's a very clear analysis of all the tension that is in that program. And, we talk about. So the word isolationism in that context is always thrown around, but it's very, what does that actually mean? The word, were the paleos really isolationist? And no, they were, basically all about American primacy in the early 90s, as much as they are today. They were quite clear that, the 21st century will be an American century, and it wasn't going to be a kind of retreat. Now, what they are, and this is quite important, and Lee and I have talked about this before, back in 1990, 1991, the paleos are arguing for a reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine, a continental, hemispheric reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine that would go from Greenland to Tierra del Fuego, right? So this is not, right? This is not the Monroe Doctrine as we know it. This is not the, in any ways anything to do. This is something much more programmatic. Pat Buchanan in the Washington Time piece in 1990. Talks about absorbing Canada, right? He's quite clear about this, that, what the United States must do when Canada breaks up, because, of course, this is in the context of the Lake Meech Accord in Canada, and there's a sense that, that Canada that Quebec might secede, and it's going to generate, fragmentation of the country, that the United States must pick up the pieces. So Western Canada, Eastern Canada, buy Greenland from Denmark, right, and make the whole hemisphere its own sphere of influence, and with an eye to continental autarky, right? Pat Buchanan was a close reader of Friedrich List, the German writer who in the United States did a lot to advance the theory of national self-sufficiency. And he's arguing, already in the 1990s that, those who are doing that best are the Chinese. And of course, he resents them deeply, but admires them for their cunning, right? And the best way, he thinks that the best way to compete with China in the future, clearly, is some kind of continental, national. He's quite vague about what they actually mean, but certainly here, recognition. So all of that.
So it's isolationism, but only once the whole American continent is controlled under American aegis, and so it's isolating the whole
in one continent.
Yeah,
I'm not even sure I would use the word isolationism, right? I mean, interestingly, the America Firsters of the 1930s, right? They were exceptionalists. They argued that America was exceptional, and it had to stay exceptional by pulling out of imperialism and pulling out of Europe and not getting drawn into the wars of the others. The America Firsters of the 1930s were vaguely, they were incredibly ambivalent and uncomfortable with the Monroe Doctrine, right? And so they were vaguely supportive of the idea as a kind of symbolic, narrative of American foreign policy. At the same time, they were against the Roosevelt corollary, right? They were against any form of policing operation in the Americas because this was neo-imperialism, this was interventionist. They weren't interested in doing any of that. And as Lee pointed out, and so in that sense, what we have here is something completely different, right? And so this becomes part of a strategy of overloading the discourse with all these terms that kind of arch back to some narrative of the past, but that they mobilize in a very different way. Same thing with realism that Lee talks about so well in this paper and just explained now. I mean, you can call it realism if you want, but this is certainly not the same realism that people who've studied international relations are used to. Right?
Yeah, I mean, it seems that there's almost no non-expansionist American vision, because even when it's in quotation marks isolationist, there's still the internal frontier and to be conquered. So there's the expansionist tendencies maybe express themselves in different ways, whether it's global policing or the internal frontier or conquering Latin America, but it's there one way or another.
Absolutely. And look, realists had no illusions about that international institutions and collective security and all those things would put an end to war and bring about world peace. But they saw these institutions as useful tools of statecraft, as ways of mobilizing support among allies and cultivating diplomatic relations and so on. What the Trump administration seems to be doing here is the opposite. It seems to thrive in alienating allies and basically squandering the goodwill that has been accumulated by Washington over the decades. And that's kind of becoming part of the modus operandi. So there's something that is quite anti-diplomatic and some anti-realist in some ways.
I mean, that's very interesting. I mean, in the Trumpian vision, and this is a question, in fact, for both of you, because Lee, you touch on this as well in your article, whether there are, I mean, if this... Because a lot of the discussion is that, we're back to the 19th century and this is all spheres of influence and so on. And in some ways, I feel like we are back with 19th century politics, but without the legacy of the Enlightenment immediately behind us, which is, I think, speaks to how tragic our times actually are. Perhaps tragedy, it probably doesn't even merit the term tragedy. But anyway, is anyone allowed a sphere of influence? I mean, other than the United States, obviously, but in the Trumpian vision, is anyone allowed their own sphere of influence, and how far does that run beyond the power's border?
I think it's somewhat ambiguous, and you can understand why people think it's a spheres of influence policy, because the overriding emphasis on Western Hemisphere is very clear, both in terms of the policy. If you think about the menacing of Panama over the canal, the menacing of Canada, Greenland, Venezuela intervention, it's all clear and it's there in the strategy that the United States wants to dominate. What they don't say is that they don't adopt this kind of continental autarky approach that JF was just talking about. There is a commitment to keeping sea lanes open in other parts of the world, which I think reflects the truly globalized nature of the American economy and the global interest of American capital, which I think that, paleos have a difficult relation to that. And I think paleoconservative thought doesn't deal with capitalism very well, doesn't really want to talk about class, might plunder Gramsci, but doesn't really want to talk about class and capitalism in a sensible way. So that's the way it talks about the Western Hemisphere. The way it talks about other powers is, it's one of these documents where you think, somebody's tweaked these sentences to within an inch of their life because they're desperate to refine it in a way that they can live with. which I've seen in many the drafting of many government documents, right? So the language is quite subtle. It says, right, we're abandoning the quest for global domination, right? There's a full-throated attack in the document on the foreign policy elite, which is basically the new class that JF was talking about. Not the Democrats, but the foreign policy elite, because they're attacking the elite of both parties, right? Because it's the uniparty. They're all made the same mistakes, defining like global domination as being in the interest of the American people. It's not. We need to prioritize the interest of the American people. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean retreat. It doesn't mean isolation. The National Defense Strategy is explicit about that. It means maintaining a global balance of power where no other rival power can threaten to dominate us. So we're forswearing global domination for its own sake, but we don't want anybody else to dominate us. And that seems quite reasonable. You might say that's also a realist policy, right? Just being able to maintain your own security. But then it goes on, and it goes on and says, well, and we don't want to waste our blood and treasure confronting every great power and middle power on the planet, right? The domination, the local domination of these powers is a timeless truth of international relations. It also sounds realist. But what it says is American security might require us to deny the global hegemony, or in some cases, even the regional hegemony of other powers. Now, it doesn't say what these cases are, but there's the carve out. It's saying in some cases, we're not even allowed, we're not going to allow other rival powers to dominate their spheres of influence. And when you read through the document, it's obvious who they mean. They mean China. They think Russia is fundamentally weak, which it is. Newsflash, Western Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Russia is not going to roll tanks into Poland. It can't even conquer 4 oblasts in Ukraine. That's the US view of Russia, actually across all the different parties. So the view is if we can make Europe great again, they can contain the Russians, right? So that means Russia isn't going to be allowed to dominate Europe. One, that's the implication. But it also can't. But 2, more significantly, China is not going to be allowed to dominate Asia. As I said, the Americans will continue to deter China from invading Taiwan, from achieving what the Chinese see as national reunification. And the South China Sea must remain open, whereas the Chinese are trying to close it. So if you're not even allowed a sphere of influence which extends just beyond your shoreline, then that's a pretty limited sphere, right? So I think there's a more narrow definition of American self-interest, although the definition of that is up for grabs. As JF's saying, there are just different views within the right about what's the sensible thing to do. I think because there is a breakdown in democratic representation in the United States, so this is not being worked out through political debate. It's just Trump gets elected, he decides. But there is no concession to say other powers are allowed to have their spheres of influence and we're not going to intrude. That you can read it in that way, but actually if you read it closely and you look at what the commitments about China are about, that's not what the policy is.
Jeff, do you have any comment on this?
Well, no, I think Lee is correct. I mean, you've got, as the closest I've found to some kind of acknowledgement of is Marco Rubio's sort of January something, and end of January 2025. He talks about multipolarity and acknowledged that, unipolarity was not normal, yet unipolarity was an exception, that the normal state of affairs in world politics is multipolarity. He's quite cagey about what that means. So there's an acknowledgement here that, America cannot. I think that the key thing is that, they just don't want America to provide the public goods anymore. That's and the American interest, the national interest is whatever challenges, the liberal order, whatever challenges liberal principles and worldviews and so on. So I think that is that. I think the sphere of influence narrative in some ways, and Lee's right that the NSS is very unclear about this. If you read, there's been a lot of statement by thinkers of the radical right around the Trump administration, or even officials that are, sort of kind of toying with the idea. But it's the sphere of influence is a form of way of channeling some kind of global relativism, right? Like he was talking about earlier, Right? There are different kind of civilizations, there are different kind of societies, and there are no common telos anymore. There are no sense of common globality over which America is exceptionally, ruling over and guaranteeing the security of, and so on. That basically, potentially, and this is very similar to what the Eurasianists are arguing in Russia, or the European New Rightists are arguing, that what you have is basically civilizational culture or spheres of influence that are epistemologically incompatible, right? That basically have different spiritual, epistemological principles, and we should stop to try to kind of claim that there is some kind of common project to all this. There's no global civil society or mankind that sort of overlays power politics and so on. So in any way, it's not a withdrawal from this idea that America is going to dominate and going to keep on being, fighting for American supremacy. It's just that it wants to shed all that narrative of universalist American identity that's been so central to American hegemony in the 20th century.
Well, it's a retreat from. I think it's a retreat from universalism.
Yes,
that's right. So it's that in that sense, it's a retreat from the global. So, for example, the United States has even denounced the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Not just said, "Oh, we have some problems with it." Denounced the idea that there should be a kind of shared aspiration towards development, and this reflects the new class. The critique of the new class is that you've been imposing this particular model of doing development on developing countries, and it's been disastrous. It hasn't worked. It's also alienated their elites from their public. So we're just not going to do that anymore. So it's very explicit all the way through the document, right? We shouldn't try to hector the Gulf monarchies and try to get them to abandon their traditional way of life. We shouldn't be promoting liberalism and democracy in Africa. Yep. So in that sense, it's a retreat from the universal, but it's not a retreat from the idea that America is first, the most powerful country on the planet, and it can basically do what it likes. But it is a retreat from providing, as JF says, the ideological justification and the material concessions that previously sustained that primacy, because it allowed some people to buy into it, to say, well, it's not just America that benefits from this order. We all benefit to some degree. And as Mark Carney said at Davos recently, that was always based on a lie, but we went along with the lie because we got something out of it. Well, now clearly you're not going to get anything out of it, so we're not going to go along with the lie anymore. And this is obviously the contradiction at the heart of the America First project, right? It's all about rebooting American primacy, but it takes away the foundations of that primacy in the ideological sphere and in the material sphere. And the idea is that other powers will step up and do the stuff that maintains a US desired order. But of course, they've now got very little incentive to work with the United States in a lot of cases, except where if they don't, they risk their survival. Cases like South Korea or Japan, for example, worried about China and North Korea. There are incentives still to cooperate and therefore to capitulate to the United States. But for a lot of countries in the world, it will be no longer clear why they should favor a US-led order and why US leadership is still desirable once you strip away the things that made it at least partially desirable to some people.
Yeah, and this ties, the anti-universalism ties quite directly to the ideas of the European New Right. I mean, I think in one article, JF, you cite, I think it's Alexander Dugin saying, the problem is not to say, well, the problem with democracy or freedom and so on is that, we need to demand more freedom, more democracy. It's to, subject those ideas to ideological critique themselves, to deconstruct the very notion of freedom, democracy, and so on. And that's where we are today. And politics is always situational. It's always in reaction to something else rather than something that emerges out of nowhere or from first principles. And so here the reaction is very clearly against liberal idealism, at least in terms of international relations, and against perhaps Enlightenment universalism as a whole. Now, it seems to me that that a departure from liberal idealism would have two different routes out. And in fact, it plays out this way. One is back to realism or a populist isolationism. But as we've just been seeing and as you've been commenting, this is not realism as you would normally understand it. It's not a world of sovereign nation states with non-interference between them. That it isn't exactly how this plays out, certainly not in the hands of the Americans, for whom it's that seems to be, in a way, ideological coding for further expansionism, or at any rate, it's not a respect for sovereignty and national independence as traditionally understood. The other way out from liberal idealism or reaction to it is towards something more ideological, towards a sort of civilisationalism. Now, firstly, I want to understand if I've characterized this correctly. And secondly, to ask you what the content is of the right's civilizational nationalism. And I don't even know if it's right to say that it's civilizational nationalism, because nationalism would seek to unify a people within a state, and so I'm not sure if it's certainly a civilizational chauvinism, I guess, but I don't know if it's a nationalism. I think to just cite two examples of the radical right giving voice to this. So Stephen Miller at Charlie Kirk's memorial service declared that our legacy hails back to Athens, to Rome, to Philadelphia, to Monticello, the latter being a metonym for Thomas Jefferson. And then Giorgio Meloni has repeatedly, in many speeches, defined the West as being rooted in Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Christian humanism or Christian values. And again, the notable absentee in this, if we're going to reclaim some sort of European legacy or Western legacy, would be the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is never mentioned by them. And I think that, the absentee there tells you all you need to know about what the radical right is thinking, what its values and principles are. So I guess firstly, am I correct that the departure from liberal idealism leads as much to some sort of populist isolationism as towards a civilizationalism? And what exactly is this civilizationalism, which is not that easy to say?
Yes, and I think that's a generally sort of helpful way of thinking about it. I mean, I think, look, the thing with civilizationism is that it's incredibly vague overlay, that you can throw on top of a whole range of different kind of things, right? So if you look at the radical right, I've been on it since at least the 1970s as a way of pushing for regionalism, for localism. Some others use it as a way of bolstering the nation state, and right. What I think increasingly what you're seeing there, yes, on the one hand, it is a form of sphere of influence, geopolitical vision, right? That is a lot more cultural rather than, say, during the Cold War ideologicals. With the Cold War, to the extent there were spheres of influence, it was articulated in Enlightenment terms in some ways, right? That this was basically, right, a common struggle over a common telos and a common globality, and we agree to disagree in those zones, but ultimately here we're fighting over the same thing, and we disagreed on the answer, but right. I think a lot of what civilizationism is doing now is breaking all this down, right? It's a way of, right, it's a form of sphere of influence when basically you are removing all forms of benchmark by which you can hold power to account in some ways. They're right in within their own region. So the argument, what a radical right is arguing increasingly, I mean, you hear, one formulation of this is the civilizational state, right? This has been talked about quite a lot, is a kind of mashup of, Huntington, Schmidt, and a number of other things. But here, ultimately, is that great powers, the world is being reshaped by great powers who represent not just their own nation, but a wider civilization, right? Very similar to sort of Huntington, except that Huntington in that literature is dismissed as a Cold War liberal, right? How does Huntington portray the West? Well, he portrays it by its commitment to secularism, liberalism, human rights, democracy, and all these things. Yes, he makes the argument that all these things are not universalable, cannot be universalized against Fukuyama, but at the same time, that's how he defends it. He doesn't defend it in terms of its, history of Indo-European whatever the right likes to call it, or Christianity, or Rome, or Greece, but he articulates it very much in a kind of Cold War term, right? A version of the West that emerges, that is being articulated, the kind of post-Spenglerian version of the West, right? That the American pick over and injects some kind of universalism, right? In the context of the project of American state building in the 1920s, of creedal liberalism, civic nationalism, and America, so they overlay this with this Western civilization narrative, and America enters the Cold War as a leader of Western civilization, and the West becomes basically, the Euro-Atlantic zone plus Korea plus Japan plus Australia and all these things, and that's the West that you've got at the end of the Cold War. And what does Huntington do? He kind of recycles that version of the West, and sort of most intellectuals of the radical right, they hate it. right? They like the phrase "the clash of civilization," but they don't like his version of it, right? And that's the problem, right? And if you look at what, this goes back to what Lee was talking about earlier, what J.D. Vance is doing in Munich, like this year, like earlier on, and talking about West. That's exactly what I just said now. Like it's not the Huntington version that he's channeling there, the West that Trump is ready to abandon. Right, if it's the woke West. So here, the Trumpians are not talking anymore about a transatlantic rift like the neocons, right, between America and Europe. They make it very clear that the main conflict today within the West is between liberals and illiberals or anti-liberals in Europe and North America, and that's the problem, right? That Western civilization will disappear unless we get rid of those people, right?
Yeah, and I think it's not just those people as well, because this is where I think race comes in, right?
Yes.
That if the national security strategy is fairly explicit on this point, right? It frames immigration to Europe as a risk to American national security. Why? Because due to mass immigration, or due to liberal globalism in general, there's a lack of civilizational self-confidence, which is why Europe can't stand up to Russia on its own. That's the strategic analysis. But specifically when it comes to immigration, the concern is that as Europe becomes majority non-European, it will drift away from the United States. And what do they mean by non-European? They mean non-white. So the idea is that as Europe becomes less and less white, it won't look to the United States as being a natural ally, and therefore the United States' strategic position will deteriorate. So there's a directly ethno-nationalist, racist component of this outlook. And this is not
and
it's not
it's
new,
not just
right?
and the peripherization of the core that we're seeing, they interpret that as a demographic question, as they love to say, if you import the third world, you become the third world, and so on.
Yeah.
Rather than it being a problem of capitalism's own decadence.
And a student of mine reminded me of this just yesterday, that in 2024, J.D. Vance had said that the UK, since the Labour government came to power, would be the first truly Islamist country to get a nuclear weapon. Maybe it's Iran, maybe it's Pakistan, but no, actually it's the UK. So this obviously is referring to the presence of Muslim ministers or the Muslim mayor of London or whatever. This idea that Islamists have taken over Britain and now it's a threat. It's a threat to the United States. So this is the kind of racialization of national security. The West is not the global West. It's a particular sort of racist understanding of what the West is. So that's how the kind of immigration question in the United States is linked to this.
Maybe just one last thing before I forget. I mean, about civilizationism is that, so obviously, as Lee pointed out, I mean, what that does is it becomes a powerful tool to manipulate debates over immigration. Who's part of civilization, who's not, who can integrate to America and who can't, right? So the paleos for a long time were arguing we can't export democracy to Iraq because it doesn't fit their culture. They don't, for the same reason they cannot come here, because obviously they won't be able to integrate in America and so on.
The interesting thing about civilizationism as well is that it fits with Chinese perspectives on these questions, right? Lots of people kind of joke that China is a 5,000-year-old civilization with a nation state attached to it. And in the last sort of 10 years, the Chinese government has been pushing this narrative. They even have a global civilization initiative. And basically they're pushing this idea that everybody's got their own culture, their own way of doing things. We've got our own way of doing democracy and human rights, and you've got your way. And what we need is a live and let live approach, which meshes entirely with this sort of multipolar approach to different civilizations.
It's an incredibly powerful tool as well to forge all sorts of alliance between anti-liberal actors, right? The civilizational argument, it links diasporas, for instance, communities across the world in so many ways, but it's also something that can be mobilized and used to forge alliance between movement of the left or of the right that object to liberalism, right, whether in the global south or in the north, in the east or in the west, right? It's a language that is somewhat relativist not someone that is relativist in a very profound kind of way, that allowed a lot of different kind of actor to make all sorts of transversal alliances. Right? And this has been, I think, central in the rapid expansion of that language over the last 10 years that you've seen within the global right. It's interesting alliance, between people like, Alain de Benoit and Semi Keba in Africa, for instance, we've been pursuing a radically different kind of project, but at the same time, they both share this kind of civilisationist narrative that basically, says, well, we can't say that there's hierarchy of race, but race matters, right? That is the thing, right? And that basically, nothing wrong with Maghrebins, but they should be in the Maghreb, and so it's a way of articulating some kind of cultural pluralism in international politics, whilst at the same time pushing back against any form of racial hybrid or ethnic hybrids of cultural hybrid. Right? It's sort of homogenized in some ways at the same time.
Like a kind of global apartheid would be their ideal image.
Absolutely.
But there's a certain flexibility in this, or at least an openness, because you can kind of plug in and play from various different points. So the Indians. That sounds Indian. So there's a strain within kind of Indian thought or Indian contemporary cultural politics or whatever of conception of themselves as Aryan, and we're with the whites and we're with Israel, against the brown Muslims, right? And that plays out. And of course, the way that the Israel-Palestine conflict has been civilizationalized and played out as being the kind of nucleus, which or is the stitching point for this whole civilizational conflict, is I think is perhaps another way that this kind of is manifest in contemporary politics, or at least the kind of social media influenced global culture war that gets played out, but which of course has real geopolitical consequences to it too.
But there are tensions here, and this is maybe something to draw out. JF, is, I think you're right, Alex, in what you say about the way that Israel has been used, but anti-Semitism is a very strong strain in the paleoconservative tradition. And so I wonder, and the NSS just simply flatly asserts, and as does the National Defense Strategy, that Israel is a model ally. So we should obviously keep supporting
Israel has nothing to do with Jews. I mean, I say that kind of glibly, but really, and I see this in Brazil with the Bolsonaristas and the evangelicals, for whom the Star of David is everywhere. Israel must be defended, but they have no interest in Jews, and in other places, indeed, where there is actually Zionist anti-Semitism, right? That peculiar combination of things.
But I think what I'm trying to tease out here is contradictions within the movement itself. So some people might think that the defense of Israel is a defense of Judeo-Christian values, and some people might think, why are we prioritizing Israel's interests over America's interests? Why are we defending it? Why are we intervening in Iran on behalf of Israel? So I think there's that tension, is there not, JF, within the movement? And then the second tension, which I'd be interested in your views on, is the view, as we've discussed, is that the Americans should try to help bring to power other radical right movements in Europe, and that's this sort of tactical alliance that you're talking about, plug and play. Quite like that idea. But would it really work out in the way that they think? Because I think maybe these movements can get along in the short term because they have a common enemy. But is it actually the case that the ascent of radical right movements in Europe would favour the United States? Because my understanding from your writing on the European radical right is that they often have quite a hostile, or some of them at least have a hostile view of the United States. So maybe you can just tease out some of the internal contradictions within the radical right tradition here, and the geopolitical implications of that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's super complicated, and I always find myself, sometimes I've got to step back and try to make sense of all these things, because a lot of it sometimes just does sometimes it's not just contradiction, it just doesn't make sense, right? You look at it, and about the paleos, you're absolutely right about the question of anti-Semitism, but also there's a conflict. There's a conflict within the paleos between the Catholics and the Protestant there. And it goes to Alex's point, is a lot of that language, a lot of those rhetoric and polemics are incredibly vague and malleable, and can be articulated in all sorts of contexts in different ways to serve all sorts of purpose. And what a lot of what the anti-Semitism was largely tied to their critique of universalism, right? The Jews were, deemed to be cosmopolitans, and they had no nations of their own, and they were basically, a rejection of ethnicity, and had properly understood, and right, and so they're cast in that light. And now with Europe, again, here I think you're absolutely right. So this is quite interesting, and I think in some ways you're right. And there's a Trump factor as well that makes things even more complicated. So historically, if we look at the level of intellectuals, right, before we get to the party politics and party leaders and all this, if you look at the history of the intellectual far right, certainly in France, Italy, Belgium, in Netherlands, and Germany, there's very, very strong anti-Americanism in that context here. A lot of those sort of post-war neo-fascist or re-articulated radical right movement, post-fascist and so on, they are deeply resentful of what the United States has done to Europe, or is doing to Europe during the Cold War. So the Cold War is seen as a struggle between two versions of universalism that are both exploitative and preventing Europeans from pursuing their own autonomous civilizational project. Right? Basically, that what becomes called the West, again here in the context of the Cold War, is an Americanosphere of managerial occupation that is basically committing ethnocide on a large scale, and basically decimating Europe and its cultural heritage, and turning it into a Disneyland version of the Weimar Republic, basically, right? And an absolute kind of chaotic sort of. And here we're talking about people like Jean Thiriard, Alain de Benoit, Guillaume Fay, Stoikers, all these people, and then same in Germany, the whole range of people there who are strongly anti-American. Not necessarily that they're pro-Russian, but they do think that the anti-communist fever in Europe is basically being recuperated by Americans to their own profit, and that liberalism ultimately is more dangerous than Soviet communism because it's more insidiously ideological and consensual and hegemonic than what the Russians are trying to do. And the Russians ultimately, they can be salvaged because you have a strong ethnic sort of Slav sort of nationalist sort of like narrative that underpins all this, and so that. I think that is very much still there. And that if you look at the level of intellectual, no one in those intellectuals is actually kind of speaking out on behalf of Trump's America and thinking that things are going to change dramatically. They're very clear as to what America is doing. Same time, they're quite pleased to see a change in leadership and the attitude towards liberal governance and the EU and that sort of thing. But they're very careful. Now, same thing at the level of party politics. I mean, if you look at, again, in France, it's a great example. The Rassemblement National has been very, very cagey and very careful to associate themselves with Trump, especially in recent time, whether it's Le Pen or Bardella. I mean, these are people who have spent the last 10 years try to clean up the image of the Front National, clean up the association with the thug politics of Jean-Marie Le Pen and neo-Nazis and so on, and to look, to act and be taken seriously as professional. They see Trump as more extreme than them. They see what's happening in the US as a lot more extremist than what they're trying to achieve in Europe. They want to professionalize the far right in Europe, right? And so they're very careful as to what's going to happen there. At the same time, but they're obviously it's very difficult because there's a question of, so now increasingly you see, they're not talking about getting out of the EU anymore. Many of them are trying to reform the EU in a way that sort of suits their need better. They are conscious of the potential threat of Russia. At the same time, they're not quite clear how to deal with it because it's quite difficult, because they like, in some ways, what Putin is doing in Russia. But they're obviously quite wary of Europe not having its own defense capabilities. And so I think it's very difficult. Now, to your question, Lee, sorry, I'm rambling a little bit here. To your question, Lee, what would it look like if far-right parties in Europe would take over in the majority of country? Would they get along? It's difficult to imagine that they could actually forge any kind of meaningful long-term cooperation. Because they're so, the whole narrative is about maintaining their autonomy and not become vassals to the United States. And there's also a narrative of revenge, against the liberal elite and so on, which is seen to be so incredibly tied to American hegemony historically. So it's hard
I
to
mean, I
imagine
guess,
how. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's anti-Americanism. I think there's, two varieties in this regard. That there's the United States as avatar of modernity and the United States as avatar of post-modernity. And it depends which one you're talking about. I mean, the old European reaction, which is maybe a bit aristocratic in certain terms, was anti-American as insofar as the United States represented modernity, mass society. And the contemporary thing is a bit, it really is rather different. But I wonder, talking about the dichotomy of a radical right, which is, cleaned up and maybe a bit more conformist and looks the part, wears the suit, versus something which is much more rowdy, street fighting, violent, aggressive, etc. That doesn't, maybe, I don't know how much that maps on to its relationship to the United States, and particularly from the perspective of European countries, to what extent they're subservient to the United States. Because a lot of people have spoken, for example, about Giorgia Meloni as being kind of the future of the radical right, who has, tidied up her post-fascist party, or it certainly presents a kind of cleaner, more acceptable conformist image. But that, of course, also comes with acceptance of the EU and subservience to NATO, and actually an Atlanticism which is just as strong as, Keir Starmer's, for example, who would be just one such liberal that the radical right would oppose. So these things are tangled in ways which are not so easy to unpick, not least because they also tie into different national histories and tendencies. French sovereigntism will be stronger than the Germans will be after decades and decades under U.S. occupation. So I wonder how you see this going. I mean, is it towards conformity and ultimate kind of adaptation to institutions, or does it point in a more radical direction of break from this? And maybe it might even be worth saying where these things may differ in which countries. I mean, speaking about Europe specifically.
I think, I think so far they've been able to muddle through and to fudge things up a little bit, because the situation is in flux, because they didn't have to make, essential decisions about what side they're on. And Ukraine has been testing for many of these forces, but even that it's quite a lot of leeway for them to sort of, not really take sides and all. I mean, and look, I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm always, I'm always wary of making any kind of predictions. My sense, though, is that at least in Europe, in terms of the radical right party politics, as opposed to maybe intellectuals and other sort of, that they are moving towards some kind of, I think that they will adopt a more formal, they will, I think that they are moving towards a more, I hesitate to say centrist position, because that doesn't really, but certainly a position that is less radical than what they were in the past in some ways, because they're going to be forced to govern in one way or another. I could be completely wrong. It could, right? The alternative is that, yes, okay, they professionalize and all this, and they do so well, and then eventually they just, once they've taken over, they've introduced policies that are so incredibly radical. I'm struggling to imagine this. It seems that Europe is moving in that direction, but it's difficult. It's difficult. I think that's the $1 billion question for the next 10 to 15 years, really. Last time we had COVID, who intervened in that whole process, and that sort of. And I think again we mustn't underestimate other things and other events that can happen. And
I think the overall trajectory in Europe is towards militarized and increasingly authoritarian forms of neoliberalism. That's because they don't basically have very much to offer, because if you're not interested in reforming the political economy and addressing people's grievances at the level of their material circumstances, then you've only got culture wars, as Alex said right at the top of the show. And in the context of their concerns about Russia, you've got to have militarism, higher defense spending. So militarism plus culture wars plus
neoliberalism.
And that is, it seems to me, that is compatible with what the Americans want, because they want the Americans to stop being
the Europeans
liberal cucks and step up and spend more on defense and confront and contain Russia for them. because it's in their interest to do so. So the militarism part they're fine with. The American strategy is one of mutated neoliberalism, as we discussed on the program with Ilyas Alami on state capitalism, right? So it's right protectionism, yes, for the American economy, whilst American officials go around the world booting down doors to American capital and seizing investment opportunities, using American state financing, coupled at home with deregulation, tax cuts, unleashing cheap energy, right? It's not a retreat. It's not a new it's not a new economic order. And of course, the culture wars is the shared part, right? The attack on liberalism, the attack on the Enlightenment, effectively. So I think your instincts is probably right, JF, that they can kind of still muddle through and rub along okay with each other, notwithstanding the underlying intellectual tensions.
Well, maybe we should leave that where we are here, because we can leave that hanging. Because no doubt we'll be back with another episode specifically on the Western Hemisphere and what I like to call the B side of the West, which is Latin America, and explore how paleoconservative ideas and those of the new right play out in foreign policy and the US's foreign policy in the hemisphere. But also love to have Jeff back on at some point, perhaps to talk a little bit more in depth about some of the ideas behind the ideas of the European new right and maybe the contradictions within them, how these different authors diverge. Because I think for those of us maybe from the left or who don't spend a lot of time reading what these rightists argue, tend to put it in one bucket or assume that we know, and perhaps there are more complexities than we give them credit for. So that would be for another time. But for now, Jeff, thank you very, very much. I'm sure our listeners, I'm not always confident, but in this one, I'm very confident that our listeners will take really quite a lot from it. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was a great pleasure.
I was very struck by Pat Buchanan's essay published in 1990 called America First, Second, and Third.
Yeah.
And if you read it, it's very much of its time because the Cold War is not yet over. Mm-hmm. So, the Soviets have not yet withdrawn from Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union has not yet collapsed. But Buchanan's already looking forward to a post-Cold War order where America comes home and prioritizes its own interests in a completely ruthless way, leaves allies to look after themselves, etc. All the ideas are essentially there in 1990, as you've rightly said. Even if Trump is at least a bit more enlightened than Pat Buchanan.
Yes. I mean, he's got that phrase, right? Which struck me in that article. This is, he wants that America should not be using the Republic as an instrument to pursue globalist goal. And that, I think that's the key here, right? It's that, the Republic can be used to do supremacy and global dominance and all these things, just not globalist. Right, just not providing the public good for others. That's what bothers him more than anything else, right? It's a striking piece, that.